Pat, thank you for that kind introduction. Whenever I hear someone go over parts of my resume, my mind flashes back to my late grandmother. God called her home at the sweet age of 90 a few years ago. And whenever I would change jobs in my career move to 60 Minutes, because as I told one of the freshmen a short time ago, that when I was 18 years old, a freshman in college, I wrote on a piece of paper that I will be a 60 Minutes correspondent by age 45. That was my goal, encouraging that young man to have a vision for his life. But in the journey from college and the places I've worked in between, I would always call my grandmother and say, "Hey, Mama, I got a new job." And her response was always the same. In her North Carolina twang, she would say with pain in her voice, "What's wrong, baby? Why can't you keep a job? You're always moving around." So thank you, Pat, for that kind introduction. To the President, Board of Trustees, members here, it's an honor to be here. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you on this brisk fall day. St. Peter's College, your fine institution, reminds me of my old alma mater, Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware, Ohio. OWU is a small liberal arts college founded by the Methodist Church. My high school, Archbishop Curley High School in East Baltimore, is run by a Franciscan priest. I like to say I had the best of both worlds, a Catholic education raised in the Baptist Church. We are here this morning to discuss serious issues, and I know you guys have a full schedule. So I say to you, as the two-time Academy Award-winning actress Elizabeth Taylor said to her seventh husband on their wedding day, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." Restoring confidence from crisis to recovery. My late grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, would phrase today's topic this way. She believed that all of us, whether rich or poor, black or white, Latino, Asian, or Native American, are always in one of three places in our lives: in the midst of a storm, about to enter a storm, about to exit a storm. My grandmother was not an economist, nor a scholar, never finished high school as best I can tell. She was a farmer's wife, the mother of 7 children, and a truth sayer. Here's the truth. As I see it from a journalist's perspective, it does appear we've been in the midst of a crisis. It would appear we are headed towards recovery, but there is still plenty of danger lurking. We've all been reminded of that danger just yesterday with the shooting in Fort Hood, Texas. At last count, and last I checked a short time ago, the death toll is now at 13 American soldiers killed by an American soldier, an Army psychiatrist. 30 American soldiers wounded, all of them in stable condition now and expected to make it. It reminds us of the times that we live in. That while we can celebrate what the Yankees have done, I'd ask, if you don't mind, if we can take a moment of quiet reflection for those 13 families and those other service members who were impacted by what happened in our country on American soil just yesterday. Thank you. I'm also reminded in times like this of the great sacrifice that the men and women of our military make for our country. And I think regardless of how one feels about the wars that we're engaged in, that we owe them a debt of gratitude. Are there any veterans in the room? I always like to acknowledge the veterans. Thank you all for your service. Thank you. Thank you all for your service. And welcome home. In my profession, there's an old adage, the KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. In journalism, every story falls into one of 3 categories: a journey story from here to there, a search for treasure, or a love story. Every story, from the front page articles in this morning's Star Ledger, to the sports pages and style sections of the New York Times, every magazine article, radio or television news broadcast, and every story should have a beginning, middle, and end. For sake of our discussion, the crisis I'm most aware of, and many of us lived through, started, or at least came to our full attention, on September 11th, 2001. Before I go on, let me say for the record, I am an optimist. And optimism is a hard-earned choice. As a correspondent for CBS News and now a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes, I've been to 37 countries for the company, interviewed the last 6 presidents of the United States, some in office, some out of office, and I've watched 43 people die. I watched as foot soldiers for an Afghan warlord stoned a 15-year-old boy to death because he was a suspected Taliban soldier. I've watched as American service members were killed in action in Afghanistan and Iraq. A 19-year-old kid I met from Jackson, Mississippi, about to go home on leave to marry his childhood sweetheart. About an hour before he was to leave Baghdad for home, he was killed by an IED, an improvised explosive device. You can buy an IED right now in Afghanistan for about $10. I was one of the media witnesses to the execution of Timothy McVeigh, so I'm familiar with death. I've seen what can happen when good people with good intentions do nothing but have good intentions. Indifference, I've learned, is itself a dangerous weapon. But I've also seen what can happen when good people, determined men and women, band together for the common good. I've seen that goodness even in the midst of the most horrifying circumstances. Like all of you, I was touched by what happened in this great American city across the water, the city of New York, on September 11th, 2001. I was in New York that frightful morning, was dispatched to cover the story. By 9:30 that morning, I was almost at the base of one of the towers, standing with 3 New York City police officers. One of them noticed something floating to the ground. We thought it was a giant piece of paper, a la Columbine High School. Perhaps someone had written a message, an SOS, asking for help on a giant piece of paper. But as the 4 of us, myself and the 3 officers, focused on what was falling, we realized almost at the same moment, it wasn't a sheet we were watching, it was a woman in a dress. We watched her fall to the ground. It was the second most horrifying thing I would see that day. A short time later, one of the officers yelled, look up there. There was a man and a woman standing in an open window on one of the high floors. The glass was blown out, smoke billowing out behind them. One of the officers shouted, "Thank God they have each other." About then, the man and the woman appeared to be talking to each other. We hoped comforting each other. When suddenly they took hands and jumped. How horrible the world must have been at that moment if their best option in life was to jump. Thousands died that day. What I remember most about September 11th, 9/11, was what happened in the hours and days and weeks that followed. Those days when race or sex or political party or the size of one's 401k didn't matter. I saw people of all races helping the wounded, each person taking responsibility for their neighbor, each willing to step out on nothing to help someone else. It is that goodness in all of us I hope to appeal to this morning, that each of us is responsible not just for ourselves, but our neighbors. In the early days after 9/11, it was said that most citizens of the world believed they too were Americans. They shared our hurt, some of our anger. There was a sense that crisis would lead to recovery quickly. We should all be clear this morning, it hasn't, at least not yet. Today we are engaged in 2 wars, a healthcare crisis, an economic crisis, a perfect storm of instability. Indications are the economy is recovering, though new unemployment figures, I believe, due out today may suggest something else. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that from the experts later today. Healthcare is now a national discussion. The war in Iraq may be winding down, but all indications are the war in Afghanistan is about to heat up even more. Estimates are President Obama is considering whether to send another 10 to 40,000 troops into Afghanistan. 10 to 40,000 of America's sons and daughters. Trust me, it is a dangerous neighborhood. And if military muscle was enough to win the day, then the Russians would have been successful in the 1980s. They sent 500,000 troops to Afghanistan, or the British before them, or the French before them. Dating back to the days of Alexander the Great, no superpower has ever broken the will of the people of Afghanistan. Genghis Khan came close. Emphasis on close. I don't think anyone can accurately say whether Afghanistan is near or far from recovery. But in my business, people aren't very good at predicting the future. I remember 20 months ago when the media experts said with great conviction, the race for the White House would come down to Rudy Giuliani and Hillary Clinton. Not so much. But here's what I can tell you. There are still plenty of people around the world who mean us harm, or at the very least don't mean us much good. Some who see us as a stumbling block to their own economic rise, and cold-blooded terrorists who still see 9/11 as the day America got its comeuppance, and they long for the next 9/11. To the students gathered here, those realities should be incentive enough for you to take your studies seriously. Have fun in college. For sure, college is meant to be fun, an enjoyable experience. But be serious about your studies. Have a vision for your life that goes beyond your own self-interest. And know this, for all her many warts, America is still, by most measures, the greatest country on earth. It is the promise of America that is the envy of the world. Be good to her, young people, and she'll be good to you. It's that promise that America makes that I saw recently in an immigrant's eyes, heard in his voice. An Ethiopian cab driver I met in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago on assignment. It is the quintessential American story. As I sat in the back of the cab, we were talking about the day's events, and he had a smile on his face the whole time. So I said, well, what are you smiling about? And he says, it's just a great day to be alive, a great day to be an American. He told me the story how he and his wife had just had their first child, that child, an American citizen. He told the story of his own journey to the United States. So this son of Ethiopia, his father was a pharmacist back in Ethiopia. And during a time when the communists, he said, controlled his country, that Ethiopians weren't allowed to hold the currency of a foreign land. It was illegal. But his father, the pharmacist, a professional man, an educated man, hid in a closet in their home in a fake floorboard, a box. And inside that box was $1 US. And every so often, for encouragement, he would bring his young son and daughter into this closet, and they'd kneel down. He'd open the box and whisper. As he took out the money, he would say, only in America does the money say, in God we trust. Only in America can a man or woman live their dreams. He closed the box. They would go back to their studies. A few years later, by the time they were in high school, their father bought them 2 suitcases, a visual reminder of what his vision was for them. One suitcase was painted blue, the other suitcase was painted red, and both had white handles, red, white, and blue. It was that father's reminder to his children about the dreams he had for them. Eventually, that young man and young woman made it to the United States. He went on to George Washington University, earned his degree, is now in graduate school to earn his MBA. He's a cab driver in Washington, D.C. He owns his own home, plans to own a business, and has great dreams for his family and for their future. Only in America are such dreams possible. One of my favorite poems is by the great American poet Maya Angelou's. The poem is called Still I Rise. It is also an American story that speaks specifically to the sons and daughters of slaves once owned in this country. In one of the lines it says to those sons and daughters of people who were once slaves, you are the hope and the dream of the slave. Now, that certainly is a heritage for some in this room, not all. But all of us come from a people who dreamed of the promise of America. So despite our many problems, this is still a great country. Despite the difficulties that we face, I believe our nation still has a great future, that our best is yet to come. But it will require good people, good, decent people, smart people like the folks in this room, to have interests beyond their own self-interest, to make this country to live up to its promise. Finally, I'd like to leave you with the words of Horace Mann. Dr. Mann was the founding president of Antioch College, another small liberal arts college in Ohio. Here's what Dr. Mann told Antioch's first graduating class. Be ashamed to die before you have won some victory for humanity. I like that. Be ashamed to die before you have won some victory for humanity. If any of us hope to restore confidence from crisis to recovery, we should heed Dr. Mann's words. Be ashamed to die before you have won some victory for humanity. Thank you. God bless you. I'll be honored to take your questions. Thanks.
I think it's clear that Byron Pitts knows his stuff. I also think it would not be out of order to name him as a motivational speaker. I think that what came through very clearly to me on the sad note was that he didn't just say he'd welcome mayhem. He said he had witnessed 53 deaths. So each one was a person to him. And if you could bring these cards forward, we could move with the program, ladies. And so I want to thank him very, very much for that. This one's wrapped up like a love note. Uh-oh. But a key one for you, I think. Is the media, and those of you who work in it, a casual observer, or is it part of the equation to restore confidence?
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. My answer is I don't think that's our role. I think as a journalist, it's my responsibility to seek truth and report truth. I think as a journalist, I became a journalist. I consider myself an old school soul. I became a journalist because I believed in the notion of putting truth to power, afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. One of the things that concerns me in journalism today is what I see oftentimes, that I think concerns many of us, about when some project themselves as the voice of the far right or project themselves as the voice of the far left. I think the responsibility of journalists is to report the news and report truth. One of the things I think we've proven as a nation, that because we are good and decent people, that if Americans are given accurate information, they will make wise choices on their own without the media telling them what their view should be. I think back to 9/11 and my own personal view about what I think perhaps the media could have done, should have done differently, and how that should have been a sobering moment for us as journalists. That perhaps if we had spent more time as journalists reporting on the economy, reporting on healthcare, reporting on the issues of terrorism around the world, and less on stories on Paris Hilton and other things like that, that perhaps one of those passengers on that plane would have been aware that we live in dangerous times, that hijacking no longer meant what it once meant in our country, perhaps a trip to the Caribbean, that it had far more serious consequences. So that moment reminds me that as a journalist, it's not my job to be a cheerleader for our great nation. It's not my job to be a doomsday predictor for our nation. It is simply my job to go and report truth.
I couldn't agree with that answer more. As one who reads the paper, used to listen to the news radio, which I can't seem to find anymore, and dismiss news television as something other than accurate information. Too often it's either a cheerleader or a doomsayer. And I guess that leads us to our last question. What do you see as the future of American journalism, especially for those of us who are past the age of consent?
As I mentioned in my former remarks, I am an optimist by nature. It's kind of who I am. It's who I was raised to be. A quick side note, and in the book I wrote, it talks about my own life and about my own view of our great country. I'm a kid. I didn't learn to read until I was 12. A early therapist told my mother it was his diagnosis that I was mentally retarded and should be institutionalized. My mother is a woman of great faith. Said, I don't think so. For all of my life, my mother has worn a mustard seed around her neck, encased in a clear plastic ball. And for her, it has always been her daily reminder of the scripture in Matthew that says, if one has faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, mountain, move from here to there, and it shall move. So it is out of my mother's mountain-moving faith, and I am an optimist about all things. Thus, I'm an optimist about my profession. I don't necessarily believe these are the best days for journalism, as it's not the best days for many industries in our country. I think there is a preoccupation with the bottom line in my business, and I'm respectful it is a business, so that it has to be a consideration. But there have been other times in our nation's history where journalism had its challenging moments. Yellow journalism, and people questioned the purpose of journalism. But I'm reminded every time I go to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, one of the many things that makes us Americans and makes our country the great country that it is, beyond our military might, along with our military might, along with our, the value of free enterprise, along with our government and the value of democracy, is a free press. That I think we as a nation, as long as we are a nation of free people that values democracy, there will always be a place for journalism. I met a young man a few years ago, an intern at CBS News, very enthusiastic, like a number of the young students I met here this morning. And he says, Mr. Pitts, and explained to me why he thought television was dying and I should find employment doing something else. He says, Mr. Pitts, do you know that right now you can take your laptop anywhere in the world? You can be in the restroom, in your car, on the beach, and get the latest information anywhere in the world. I said, yes, sir. But when I was your age, they called that radio. So, yeah, these are challenging times in my profession. But again, the optimist in me tells me that this is a great country, that I don't feel threatened by or fearful of the internet or new technology. I think anything that allows us to provide information, provide facts to the American people, that's good for us, that more information is good, not less. Certainly I have some concerns about different outlets portraying themselves as journalists, and perhaps people being confused about what's journalism and what's opinion. And there's always concern about, in the world of bloggers, where their information isn't verified but put out there as fact. That concerns me. But finally, again, my optimistic spirit tells me that we as a nation, if not my generation, then the generation that follows. I met a young man here from Dallas, Texas, on the St. Peter's golf team. Polite young man. Who told me of his interest to be a journalist. So I'm optimistic about the future.
Thank you. And I think if we needed somebody to talk about restoring confidence, we could not have made a better choice. Byron, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Pat.